In this chapter, we'll see how to implement another advanced component from the Kendo UI library, the Kendo Grid. One of our new requirements for the RPS Project Tracker version 2 list of backlog items is to make it pageable and sortable. The Kendo Grid can handle these features as well as over 100 other features. You can find the documentation about all the features of the grid in the Kendo docs. Because the grid is so configurable and there are so many features, I suggest having this site open while you develop so that you can use it for reference. In this chapter, we'll set up the grid and configure it to display our backlog items. Then we'll add paging and sorting, and finally, we'll see how to use the grid with a convenient data query module. We're going to add the Kendo Grid to our backlog page. Right now, if we take a look at the backlog page, you'll see that it displays a list of PT items, these are your backlog items, in a very long list. That's why we need paging here, but we'll come back to that. Right now this is rendered as an HTML table, and we want to convert this to use the Kendo Grid instead. We also want to make sure that after our conversion, our filter buttons up here still work, filtering between My Items, Open Items, and Closed Items, and make sure you take a look at the URL. The URL reflects what filter option we have selected. We also have deep linking working here as well, just like we did on the details page, where if I go to backlog/open, it'll display the open items for me. To get the Kendo Grid installed, let's head over to our documentation. And the first component group you'll see here is the data grid. So let's click on that, open up overview, and you can scroll down to installation with Webpack right over here. Now the first step this lists is installing the theme, which is going to be very important for the grid, especially if you don't have anything else installed. And they've listed this in the documentation because the grid is a very popular component to use by itself without any other components. So you just want to make sure that this is installed, and we do already have it installed in our course. The next step has the installation of a lot of packages. These are all related to the grid. So the main package is Kendo Vue Grid, but then we have a lot of supporting packages here as well. Animation, data tools, pop-up, and data query. Data query is something we'll actually dig into a little bit later in this chapter. So let's copy this command and head out to the terminal. I need to terminate the process that's running right now because we are installing new packages, and I'm going to paste that command in here and run it. Once the installation is complete, I'm going to run the command npm run serve to kick off our development server one more time. Now that the grid is installed, let's head over to the code. In your views folder, open up the backlog page.vue component, and let's head up here to the imports. We're going to import grid, and that's coming from @progress view grid. Now under our components, we want to make sure that we are specifying Kendo Grid here as the component name that we want to use in our markup and mapping it to grid. And this is pretty much how we've done it before. Now we're ready to actually insert the grid. So let's head up here, and right over here is where we have our table. This is the current table that displays our list of PT items. So right above it, I'm going to insert our Kendo Grid. And make sure you close up the component there. Now currently when I look at the page, I do get an error saying can't resolve Kendo Vue date inputs. So I'm going to go back to the terminal and I'm going to install this manually. I'm sure this is something that will be resolved. Let's head over to the terminal. I'm going to terminate my process and run npm install, I is for install, -- save to save that to my package.json file, and then the name of the package. Once that's installed, I'm going to run my npm run serve command one more time. Okay, here we are back in the application, and we see our grid actually rendered right above our table. Nothing's there right now because we don't have any data, but something is showing up at least. Now I do want this grid to take up a certain amount of space vertically, and I'm going to do that manually with styling. So I can apply the inline style tag, or if you prefer, you can add a class. I'm just going to add a style tag inline with a height of 400 pixels, which will make my grid take up this amount of space. The grid is going to provide scroll bars if the amount of rows exceeds the vertical viewport. And this is a good amount of space for my application here based on the vertical space I have available. So if the number of rows exceeds this vertical space, I'll get an automatic scroll bar here. Let's get some data in here. Our table already has a binding to items, which is a collection of PT items that's available in our component. And it's right over here. Let's have a quick look at PT item and what that type is. I'm going to press F12 to navigate there, and you'll see that each PT item has a type, an estimate, a priority, a status, an assignee, and so on. Now we're going to be displaying some of these properties as columns in our grid. So you can always refer to this file, pt item model, if you want to reference the type of the item. And pt item also inherits from pt object base. So if we navigate there, you'll see that we're going to have date created and title. We'll also be displaying date created, where we'll get a chance to use date formatting in one of our grid columns. Okay, let's go back here and we're going to bind this items property to an attribute in our grid. And this attribute is data-items. Let's bind that to items. And let's head over to the application. And you'll see that still there's nothing there. However, the grid does detect a certain number of items now and provides the scroll bar that I was talking about. So you can scroll through all that data that's supposedly there. It's not really showing because we haven't defined any columns yet. We haven't told the grid how to render these columns. So that's what we'll do in the next lesson. Well, we've defined our grid and we've also bound the items property to the data items attribute of the grid. So we have the data populating the grid, but we don't have any column definitions yet, so nothing is displayed. To fix that, we're going to bind the columns attribute to a property that we'll call columns, and we'll define the columns property in our component. So let's head down here to our component, and right over here, I'll create a new constant called columns, which is going to be an array that's going to define how each column behaves, what type it is, what title it has, and so on. There's a special type we can use that's coming from the Kendo Vue Grid package, and it's called grid column props. There it is. If I press enter here, Visual Studio Code will automatically import that for me, and that's going to be an array that we're going to be passing in to the definition here. And just to show you where that's being imported, it's being imported right from the same package where grid was. This array is going to take a list of objects. Each one of these objects is of type grid column props. So if I open up a new object and press Control Space here, you'll see what properties are available for us to define on each column. As you can see, there's quite a bit. And you can take a look at the documentation for this entire API, but we're going to use only a few of these properties. The main one being field. Field is going to be the mapping between the items that we're binding to, the objects that we're binding to, which are PT items, and the columns here. The first field that I want to bind is going to be the type field. In the completed application, you'll see that we have the first column of this grid show an icon for the type of item that it is. Bug or PBI or chore or impediment and so on. We'll handle the icon rendering a little bit later, but for now we need to make sure that we're going to be binding this to the type. And to show you where that's coming from, if we go back to the definition for the PT item, type is of PT item type, and that's either PBI, bug, chore, impediment. In hindsight, it's probably not a good idea to name your properties type, but this is a demo, so we'll keep it as such. So we're binding the first column to the type field, and we can also provide a title. Now in our final application, the first column doesn't actually have a title, but if you leave the title blank, Kendo UI will automatically generate the column title based on the field binding. So we need to leave an empty space here for the title. And we can also define a width. This is the number of pixels for the width of that column. Okay, so that's the type column. I want to show another example of binding to another column, and that's the title column, so that we can actually display the title, and the title will be title. Now before this is going to work, we need to of course return the columns property from our component definition so that it can be bound. Okay, let's take a look at what we have so far. Here we go. Now we have a grid with some data in it. So we can scroll all the data, and we have the type column bound. Notice there is no column title there because we provided a blank title, and all the types are listed there as strings, but we're going to convert that to images very soon. Now we need to fill in the rest of the columns. Why don't you go ahead and try this out as an exercise? Go through the rest of the fields that we're going to need, the same fields that we've used down here in the table, and add them to our grid yourself. If you want to be adventurous, you can even try adding templates for each of the columns that are rendered as non-text. When you're done, come back and let's do this together. All right, let's get some of these other columns in here. I'm going to copy and paste the title column a couple of times. Let's get priority in there with the title priority, and we'll set the width on this one to be 100. I also want estimate. I'm going to skip the status for now, and let's call that estimate with the width of 100. And let's do one more. Date created. Now date created is actually a date type, and I'll give that a width of 160, And let's have a quick look at this. I'm actually going to omit the title from date created just to show you something. And when you take a look at this, you'll see that date created is actually the name of that column. So the Kendo grid actually infers the name of the column from the name of the property if you don't specify one. And that's what I was talking about earlier. So let's provide the title to be just created. Notice that our grid is starting to look like an actual grid of data. However, there are a few things we can change about this, especially that date column. We definitely don't want to be rendering our dates like this. Let's add one more field here, and that's going to be after the type, and that's the assignee field. So I'm going to give this a title of assignee and give this a width of 260 to accommodate the avatar. An assignee is actually a complex data type. It's an object of type PT_user. So the grid is not going to know how to render that at all, and it's going to show it as object. And that's not very helpful, is it? We'll fix that. At least now we have all our columns in place the way we want them. We just need to be able to render them properly. And we'll do that in the next lesson. So our grid is currently rendering, but we do have a slight issue with some of the columns. The first column that's showing the type needs to be an icon. The second column needs to show the assignee avatar. We need to have some special styling for the priority, a little bit of styling on the estimate, and our created date must be formatted nicely instead of just converting the date to string. Basically, we want our columns in the grid to look pretty much just like they do in the old table that we've used down here. And we're going to borrow heavily from the styling that we've already created in the table so we don't have to redo all that work. And the concept behind custom rendering is very similar to what we've done earlier in this course when we use templates to render custom rows for the drop-down list and for the combo box. If we go to the documentation for the grid, under custom templates, you can see the ways in which templates can be used here using either the cell render property that will customize all the cells, or you can set a cell option for each of the column definitions. And this is the method that we're going to use right now. But just to give you an example of what the cell render method looks like, if you go to the example here, you'll see that they provide a cell render function right here called myTemplate. And this defines the template for all the columns. So you create only one template here. You call it myTemplate. That name must match. The props that are going to be passed in here contain the information for each row. And then you create one function that's going to handle all the different columns for that particular row. Here's the function definition right here. Get nested value. It's going to accept a field name. And based on the field name, you can then do a switch statement and render a different look for each of the columns. So that's one way to do it. And if you need a reference to do it that way, you can take a look at this documentation. However, we're going to use the cell option method. And this is going to be a little different because we're going to define a separate template for each one of our custom columns. So let's head back to our code. And we're going to find our Kendo grid right over here. Inside the Kendo grid, we're going to define some templates. Let's start with one of them. Let's create a template tag in here. And this is going to be a very simple one. And the most simple one I can see here is the estimate column. It's just basically going to spit out that same value, which is a number, but with a slightly different color and font size. We just have a class for that. So let's go back to the code. And we need to give this template a vSlot attribute. And we're going to assign a name for this template, which is going to be estimate cell. We'll use that in a moment. We're going to set that equal to and pass in the props. Now the underlying grid implementation actually renders as an HTML table. So what we're doing essentially here with this template is overriding the table data elements. So we need to provide the new table data elements that we want to use instead of the default rendered ones. But we also need to make sure that we bind the class to the class that's coming in with Kendo UI for each of the table data elements. And we get a hold of that class by using props. And props.className will have all the classes that are necessary to go along with our Kendo UI theme. We're going to follow the same exact structure for every single one of our columns. Now, in order to get the contents of the table data, we're going to refer to the previously created responsive table that we had. So let's head over to where we have the estimate. And here's the table data element for the estimate. And we already have the HTML that we need inside the table data that displays the estimate the way we want it. So why mess with perfection? We're going to copy this and let's bring it up here and paste it inside of our new table data definition. However, we also need to fix up the binding here. I is meaningless now within the context of this template, but we can still get a hold of the estimate because props has the data item on it, which is actually the row, and the row that contains our PT item. Data item in this case is the PT item that's being rendered for that row, and it has the estimate value on it. But we're not done yet. If we take a look at the app now, you'll see that estimate is still being rendered the way it used to be. We need to tell the column definition to use this estimate cell template now. So let's go down to the code where we have the column definitions right over here. And here's our estimate field. We need to provide one more property here, and that's called cell. That points to the name of our new cell, which is estimate cell. Once we do that, you'll see that now our estimates are being rendered exactly the same way they were before in our table. Okay, so that was a pretty simple one. And by following the structure, you can create the templates for the rest of these fields. And as an exercise, go ahead and try doing the rest of the fields on your own. You can go ahead and pause the video and try this out. And when you're done, come back here and we'll finish this off. Okay, hopefully you've tried that out. Let's do this together now. I'm going to make a little bit more space here, and I'm going to copy this template and create a structure that I can copy and paste easily to fill up the rest of my templates. So I'm going to remove the span, and I'm going to keep the TD with the class name. And the only thing I'm going to change for now is the name of the template. By the way, notice that feature is actually telling us that this slot is already in use. So it's not letting you use the same exact template name, which is great. And we don't want to do that. So for this first one, we're going to need the type cell. That's going to have the type image. Our next column is going to be the assignee cell. We'll leave the title alone because we're not going to be changing that. So this will show you that you don't have to use a template for one of the columns if you don't need to. Next, we'll do the priority cell, and we have the estimate cell already. And finally, we'll do the date created cell. Now we just need to come down here to the code, and where we have the column mapping, we just need to provide the cells for these. Let me open this up to give us more space. So I'm going to provide a cell for the type, which is going to be type cell, assignee cell, title won't have a cell template. Then we'll have a priority cell, and finally we'll have a date created cell. Let's go up to our table definition, and we'll start off with reusing the indicator for our type. So I'm just going to copy this image right out of the table and paste it right inside of our template for the type. Don't forget to change this I, which was a variable when we iterated over the table rows, but it no longer has any meaning inside of our template. We do need to use props.data item in here. And if I go back to the application and I refresh, you'll see that our type column now has pretty icons in it. Now let's get the assignee column done. Back here in the table, I'm going to copy the image, which is the avatar for the assignee, and paste it into our template. Again, instead of the I, we need props.dataitem.assignee.avatar, and there's our avatar. Now, it would also be nice if we had the name of the assignee right next to the avatar, and we can make that addition pretty easily. Let's go ahead and wrap our image here inside a div. Let's close that div. And since we have access to the entire data item and the assignee, we can just create a span here and data bind props.dataitem.assignee.fullname. And now we have the name of the person next to their avatar. A little bit of styling wouldn't hurt, of course. So I'm going to add a style inline here, margin left 10 pixels. And I'm actually going to remove one of these styles, the D block, because we want this avatar to be inline. And there we go. That looks much better. All right, two more columns, priority and created. And this follows pretty much the same exact pattern that we've been doing. Let's get that priority span, and let's paste that in here in the priority template. Again, we'll replace I with props.dataitem, and that's going to be calling this function as well as the inline binding for the priority itself. Let's have a look at that. And there they are. Great. And finally, date created is going to be a formatting of the date. We're going to be using date created to date string. Pretty simple. And that's going to be inside a styled span. So let's head over here and put that into our template. Replace the I with props.dataitem, and we should be done. Now all we got to do is just remove this responsive table, and that completes our grid. Now we have a very nice looking grid with all our columns styled properly. So now all that's left to do with our grid is just implement some of the peripheral functionality that the grid offers. Paging, sorting, and events. We have our grid on the backlog page, and we have the button filters working and the URL working as well. So the data connections are working just fine. However, we're showing way too many items on this grid. And as part of our requirements, as part of this lesson, we're going to implement paging. Let's head over to the code and the backlog page and find the Kendo Grid declaration right here. Paging is made up of a few different properties working together. The first thing we need to do is enable paging on the grid itself, and we do this just by setting the pageable attribute and setting that to true. You can see that that turns on a footer down here, but paging is not going to work yet until we define a few more attributes and an event that we need to bind in order to make the grid pageable. The first is skip, and I'm going to bind that to a property that I'll define as skip in the component. Skip is going to be a number defining how many items we want to skip before showing the items on the current page. In other words, this kind of represents the page that we're on. Then we need to bind take, and it's going to give us the number of items we want to show per page. So I'm going to bind that to a property called take. And finally, total is going to be the number of items in the entire collection. I'll bind that to total. Now the reason total is separate is because typically you would perform your paging on the API side, on the server side. However, in our case, we're grabbing all the items based on the filter and returning all the items to the UI side in one call. And that's fine for the number of items we have. If you don't have that many items, this is a perfectly acceptable solution, client-side paging. But let's say you have thousands or even millions of items. In that case, you don't want to return all those items to the client. That's just not going to work well. You want to return only the set of items for that particular page, and then the number of total items so that they can be displayed and the number of pages can be calculated. So that's what total is here to support. And finally, there's an event that we need to bind called page change. We'll bind that to a handler called onPageChange. Notice that the page change event is all lowercase. All right, let's head down to our code and define all these properties and events. Right after our column definitions is a good place. I'm going to create a constant called skip, and I'll initialize that to 0. I'll create another constant called take. Remember, this is the value that represents the number of items per page, and I'll set that to 10. Now we need the total. And total is going to be a calculated property, and in the land of Vue, that's called computed. So we're going to create a function that returns the number of items that we currently have. So items.value.length. However, if items happens to be undefined, then we want to make sure we check for that. If that's going to be the case, we're going to return 0 for total. Let's also define the page change handler, and we're going to go down here where we have our handlers. Right after toggle modal is a good spot, and we called it onPageChange. And this is going to receive an event, and this event can actually be strongly typed. We can use an import from the grid package, and this is going to receive a grid page change event. This event is going to provide us with new properties for skip and take. They're going to be on the page property. Now page is of type any, it's not strongly typed, so we have to use skip and take without strongly typing that. And we're going to set skip.value to event page skip, and we're going to set take.value to event page take. And the last step here is to add all these new properties and handler to our return. Skip, take, total, and onPageChange. Now this won't work just yet. You'll see that in our app, we do have our pages shown here. We can even change the page, and the page indicator displays the correct information. However, our grid is not paging yet because the data we're providing to the grid itself is still our items collection and not the paged items. These are not items that are taking our paging into account. So we're going to create a new property that's based on the existing items, but also take into account skip and take. I'm going to call this new property grid data. And it's also going to be computed because it's going to act on items, but it's going to use the slice function of the array in order to take skip and take.value plus skip.value. So this is going to return just part of the array based on the new skip and take values that we receive from the pager. It'll give us just one page of items. Now, instead of binding the grid to items, we need to bind the grid to the new grid data property. And of course, don't forget to return the new grid data property from the component in order to have this all work. All right, let's have a look. Well, the scroll bar is much shorter, so that's a good sign. It looks like we do have 10 items on the first page. And you can see that we are showing 1 through 10 of 107 items. If I go to page 5, you can see that the items did update. So we're showing different items in the grid, and the pager is showing 41 through 50 of 107. Excellent. So now we know paging is working. Let's get on to our next requirement, which is sorting, and we'll do that next. So far with our data grid, we've been going about things in a brute force sort of way. What do I mean by that? Well, we have certain functions and certain events and certain attributes that we bind to get things working in the grid. Pageable and page change are examples of this. We're going to keep with this method, but we're going to introduce another library here so that we can implement sorting. And this is a library that we've already installed. It's the data query library. This is a library that helps us work with data, and it's especially useful for the grid. We're going to start using it in this lesson. The idea behind the Kendo data query library is that it's going to make working with data much easier and more abstracted. Let's go over here to our code, and I'm going to do some imports here. This is going to be coming from the Progress Kendo Data Query package. It's a package that we've already installed when we installed the grid. This library is not tied to any particular component or even the JavaScript framework that we're using, Vue. It's just a generic way of working with data. We're going to import two things from here, order by and sort descriptor. We'll use that in a moment. Let's head over to our grid now, and we're going to bind a couple of extra attributes here. One is we're going to make our grid sortable, and we're going to set that to true. And then we're going to bind something called sort. I'll explain what this is in a moment. We're going to create a new property in our component called sort, and this is just going to be an array of sort descriptors. And that's a pretty complex way of saying that it's just going to tell the grid how we want it to sort its data. Basically, a sort descriptor is just a way to tell the grid what column we want to use for sorting and what direction we want to use for sorting. Finally, we want to define the sort change event. Again, notice it's all lowercase, and we're going to call that onSortChange. All right, so we have a couple more things to declare here. Let's go down to the code, and right under take, we're going to define sort. This is going to be an array of those sort descriptors that I was talking about, and we're going to initialize it. So we're going to provide the initial value, which needs to be an array. Each item in the array is a sort descriptor. If I press Control Space inside here, you'll see that it is strongly typed, and we can define a field and a direction. The field we're going to sort by initially is going to be title, and we'll also provide an initial direction, even though that's optional, and we're going to set that to be ascending. Now let's go ahead and return sort from the component. And when we have a look at the application now, you'll see an arrow pointing up next to the title column. Now the grid data itself is not sorted yet because we don't have the handler yet. However, you can see that the arrow is there and the arrow is pointing up. However, if we go back to our sort descriptor and set the direction to descending, you'll see that the arrow is now pointing down. All right, let's go back to the code and define our sort change event. Right after the on-page change event is fine. And this is going to have an event as the parameter, which is going to be strongly typed as the grid sort change event. And you can probably guess where this is going. The event has the new sort property that is a sort descriptor array. So we need to set our components sort.value to the new incoming event sort that's going to provide the new data for us. Let's go ahead and return onSortChange function in our component. And now when you tap on the title column, you'll see that we're cycling through ascending, descending, and not sorted at all. So we're now taking care of the state of the sort. However, the data that's actually returned to the grid is still not sorted yet because we're binding the grid to our grid data property. And all we're doing is just taking an unsorted slice of the array, of the items array. We're not taking care of sorting here. So how do we sort? Well, remember that order by function that we've imported from Kendo Data Query? This is a special function that sorts any items based on sort descriptors. So what I'm going to do here is in our grid data, I'm going to return order by, and the first parameter to order by is going to be the data itself that we want to sort. which is the slice of the array. And the second parameter is going to be our array of sort descriptors. So that's sort.value. Now for extra safety, we want to make sure that items.value actually exists. And if it does, then we'll return the order by result. But if it doesn't, we'll just return an empty array. Now, if we go and try to sort the items here, you'll see that in fact we are sorting our table by title. So that's sorting the grid. You might have noticed that our grid is looking pretty good now, and it's fulfilling all the requirements, but there is just one thing that stopped working, and that's getting to the details page. We used to be able to click on a row in our table and get to the details page, but now we can't. So there's one more event that we need to handle in our grid in order to be able to do that. Let's go back to the code and find our Kendo grid. I'm going to bind the row click event. Please pay attention to the casing here. It's all lowercase again. And I'm going to call the handler onSelectionChange. Let's go down to the code. We're going to create the onSelectionChange handler here. Right under the sortChange event is fine. We'll keep all our grid related events here. And this event can be strongly typed as well. We'll import the grid selection change event. This event has our data item on it. That's the item for that row. Right now, it's not strongly typed, so we're going to cast this to pt item, which we know is the type of each item in each row. Let's save that off to a constant called selected item. Here we're going to use the router to push a new URL or a new route onto our application so we can navigate to the details page. And we'll go to detail / here we'll use the ID of the selected item, and we'll take them to the details screen. All right, let's return this function from the component and go to our application. Now we can click on the row here and it'll take us to the new route, which is the details route. And now we're on the details page where we can navigate between our different tabs that we've implemented earlier. Great. Now our backlog page is complete.